Welcome to In the Hot Seat with the Tenney Group. I'm Spencer Tenney. It's good to be with you. With me today, globally recognized thought leader in intermodal transportation, Ted Prince, co-founder and chief strategist at Tiger Cool Express. Ted, welcome to the hot seat, sir.
Well, thank you, Spencer. It's nice to be here.
All right. Well, before we heat things up a little bit, sir, why don't you just take maybe 30 seconds or so and tell us about the things that are going over there at the work at Tiger Cool Express.
Well, we're a startup that's 10 years old. We're in the temperature controlled business, and we have acquired the former Union Pacific Cold Connect facility in Burbank or Wauwua, Washington. It's going to be an intermodal ramp, and it's going to serve both our business going east and ISO boxes going back and forth to the ports of Tacoma and Seattle.
Well, I think that's wonderful. Well, let's jump right in there and get to some hot topics here. So for those that aren't familiar with you, obviously you've been in the industry for a while, widely regarded as your peers as a thought leader across a number of different issues. So let's just talk about, what do you see as the major issues facing the freight industry right now?
I think the biggest issue is that most people outside of freight, and even some people inside freight, don't understand freight. Freight is complicated. And if you compare freight to passenger and you think about what the remedial actions are, passenger, you can look out your window. I need a traffic light here, or I need to put another lane on this road or this interstate. The paraphrase Tip O'Neill, all passenger is local. But freight is complicated. It moves in corridors. It's global. It reassembles itself, and it's very difficult. And you see both sides of the aisle really demagoguing it and not understanding what it is. And we saw that with the supply chain. About 20 years ago, I remember reading the 9/11 Commission report, and I was sitting on a plane reading it, and I said, well, this is really good because it addressed 9/11, but when our supply chain melts down, they've already written the report analyzing the failures. Because if you go through that report and you look at the high level of things, there's a lack of imagination. People didn't understand the risk. Government is fragmented, disaggregated, and ineffective. And all of those things that they talked about in national security were the case then, and they still are the case with supply chain and the aspects of freight in it.
So, I mean, you just said something really interesting. Do you view the current state of our supply chain a national security threat?
Yes. I mean
that's
yeah.
Just elaborate on that a little bit. I think that's fascinating.
Well, first of all, fortunately, we're not in any hot wars. But getting supplies. I remember I've been a teacher, and we had our students over at NATO headquarters in Brussels, and they were explaining how they got jet fuel into Afghanistan. Now that was a real supply chain adventure, and you almost have to go back to Hannibal and getting his elephants across the Alps. But our economy is a supply chain issue. Sustainability is a supply chain issue. All of those things are interrelated, going back to what I was saying. If you think about the issues that impact freight, it's not just pure transportation. You have trade policy, foreign policy, environmental policy, industrial policy, all of those things, urban policy, all of those things are a Venn diagram that all circulate around freight transportation. Mm-hmm. It's ubiquitous. If we don't understand it, it's going to be popping up and causing problems when you don't expect it.
Is there an area of our current government policy where you feel like we're getting it right as it relates to the supply chain and logistics?
On freight? No.
Mm-hmm.
I really can't think of one, which is distressing.
That's the That's not good. That's not good at all.
Well, no, and part of the problem is the coverage of it. So
Mm,
I think about 2 years ago, 60 Minutes, Bill Whitaker went out and did this big piece about the supply chain problem. And he went out to the port of Los Angeles, which he misidentified as the port of Long Beach. He didn't even know where he was. And the issue there was movement. So you would say, okay, well, if you're in the port of LA or Long Beach, there are any number of parties that are involved in transportation. And yet
mm,
he didn't talk to a single one. He talked to three people, none of whom move anything. And,
mm,
except moving bytes and hot air and money. Ports don't
mm.
move anything. Ports of LA and Long Beach, they're like the house in Vegas. They just take a cut. They're not involved in moving anything. So when they talk about
Right.
this is a transportation strategy, it's not.
Hmm.
And
Interesting. Now, to that point, here recently, this is probably within the last week. I pay attention to your post, Ted, and so I've told multiple people I really appreciate how critical and constructive feedback you give, like on a variety of different journalists. But you had something where you had a thumbs up or high praise for a recent article about the Knight Swift deal. I believe it. Correct me if I'm wrong. I think it might have been Wall Street Journal. Something about the. So that hit me. I said, so what about that piece of journalism allowed you to say, hey, that is good reporting on our industry?
they understand the business. I would say the Wall Street Journal, and putting aside people like the Journal of Commerce, but the Wall Street Journal and the LA Times, I think are really the only big media places, providers that get it. The New York Times is clueless. Washington Post is clueless. Television is clueless. It's if it bleeds, it leads. So we're getting a
Right.
lot of coverage of East Palestine, terrible tragedy, but people don't understand. The big issue there is nobody has explained to the fact that all of those cars involved in the derailment didn't belong to the NS. In fact, they didn't belong to the railroad. They belonged to leasing companies that provide them to shippers. And it doesn't excuse what happened, but it does make the solution more complicated because you have a lot of moving pieces. Freight is complicated.
Is it a product of just not having enough space to provide full context for the story, or is it a matter of journalistic just laziness?
Um, well, I would say certainly the former is an issue. You need space
Mm,
um, to address complicated issues. But I would take it a step further than journalistic laziness. I would say it's journalistic malfeasance. Because if you're a
oh
journalist,
wow.
you have a responsibility to get the story. And if you don't get the story and somebody points it out to you, then you have corrections. Um, there was a piece on something that the journal had, and I went back. I said, you're wrong, and they posted a correction. Okay, no one's that's fine. But when you have people, so-called, who believe they're journalists, represent themselves as journalists, and have never once responded to a factual counterclaim, they've never acknowledged it, and they've never corrected themselves. So that's a problem. That's an ethical issue.
Yeah, that's definitely different there. So we got some problems about. It's hard to tackle big problems when the vast majority of the people that are affected by that don't understand it. So let's talk about what you're doing to affect this issue around creating more intelligence within the supply chain.
Okay. Well, I've written well over 400 pieces, in addition to my social media running commentary. I've been a firm believer in education from very early in my career, from some of the mentors who set examples for me. I have literally run classes around the world on intermodal. I set up a curriculum at a university. I do seminars. I try to mentor new entrants to the world of transportation. And I would say with what we're doing in Wallula right now, I was out in Olympia last week, state capitol, meeting with legislators, talking to them. Um, I had 30 minutes with the lieutenant governor, and he was so excited by the project that he kept us over just asking questions. It addresses a plethora of issues. The eastern part of the Washington state is agriculture and it needs jobs. The western part of the state is concerned about congestion, environmental degradation, and what have you. And the fact that the port was built for an operation 40 years ago that's changed, and that this can accommodate it. Um, it's a series of just going out and working and articulating and answering questions.
No, I love that. You mentioned having some mentors. I'd love if you'd be willing to share who have been, a couple of the folks that profoundly influenced, your career and your influence within the transportation industry.
Um, sure. Well, there are two that come to mind. One was one of my early bosses at Conrail. His name was Jim Down, one of the smartest people I ever worked for. He left very shortly after and went on to run, it was TBS, Oliver Wyman, Mercer globally. And he was the one who taught me to ask questions. He said, we went to a consultant came in and gave us a story, really a story, not a study. And afterwards, he asked me what I thought. I said, I think he's full of it. He said, well, why didn't you say anything? I said, well, I was being polite. You paid him a lot of money for that story. He goes, yes, that's right. But your instincts were right and you should have spoken up. So ever since then, I have, and anyone who has questions about my questioning, I would refer to Jim. Um, uh,
Some people are taking note of that
yeah,
right now, Ted.
and ironically, I got into this business completely by accident. Literally, someone took my resume to a Rolling Stones concert, and I was in the finance department at Conrail, and they fired everybody in the intermodal department, and Jim Hagan sent Jim down there to study it. And this was back then, spreadsheets were green and 13-column paper. And he was brilliant, but he really didn't like numbers. His wife was the Wharton placement director. She remembered me. He said, well, he's down there. He's a numbers guy. He can probably help you. And that's how I got into intermodal. And as they say, the rest is history. The
Wow.
other person, sort of perhaps on the opposite corner of Myers Briggs, was a gentleman named Ray Asensio, who had really come up through the ranks and taught me a lot about operations and how things were. I hired him. He hired me to leave Conrail and go to work for an ocean carrier that was a real opportunity. But and both him and also Tom Finkbeiner, who I've known as a customer, colleague, and a friend. Um, Sometimes just because you're screaming at each other doesn't mean it's not personal. Very early in my career at the railroad, they said the problem with you college kids is you take everything personal. So it may not be, the collaborative methodology that we all seek today, but it was certainly engendered frank discussions of alternative
Mm-hmm.
views, and sometimes you just need to do it, and it's like a cloud burst, and then it's over, and you move on, but you covered the issues.
Yeah. I do think that there is something to be said about um, candor being a form of respect. Because if you didn't respect somebody, then you probably wouldn't speak candidly with them.
Right.
And so I do think that there's something to that. And I also think that you're seeing some evolution in terms of people being overly sensitive about tiptoeing around just basic communication.
Well, that
So yeah.
candor also goes to accountability.
Hmm.
So, and maybe I've become my father in this, but when you look around and see what happens, um, you think back to even 10, 15, not to mention, 30, 40 years ago, that would have been a CEP, a career ending performance. But it's not anymore. And I'm not, advocating Islamic justice where you just take them out in the parking lot and shoot everybody. But
Right.
there's very often, it just seems that there's no accountability for repeated failure either.
Right. No, and honestly, I mean, I think that's a much broader conversation that maybe you and I'll have at an event at a later
Yes,
date,
with
and I would
with
welcome
an
it, Ted.
adult beverage, but yes.
That's probably the only way we'd get through it. Let me transition back over to making this change. Clearly, you're passionate about the industry, and those that read your commentary, see glimpses of your vision for it. So what are the factors that can actually affect change in the way that you would like to see it?
Um, can I sort of tease that apart, Spencer? I think
Sure, go ahead.
so. We we have an issue right now in our business, and it's specifically we see it with the railroads, but it's everywhere. Which is that if you're a public company, who do you exist for the benefit of? There used to be
Hmm.
this idea that there was this triad of stakeholders, customers, customers, employees, investors, and you're sort of seeing now that the hedge funds, which are a lately, they came to the railroad industry later than others, but it's a terrifying factor, and it really gets to the question of how much is enough. Is a
Hmm.
60 OR sufficient, or if you could get to 55, do you do it even if you have to have a scorched earth? In the background, I'm thinking of Atlas Shrugged and Who is John Galt, but I think it's a real issue, and I think that regulators have to sort of struggle with that. The
Hmm.
other issue is, I think, is sustainability. Um, I think that there are still some climate people who question the science, reality, and urgency of climate change. I would point out that probably the leading um, intellectual thought leader on climate change in the government is actually the Department of Defense, because they're looking at it every day and thinking about how it's going to impact the Norfolk Navy base or how it's going to affect water in the Middle East. So what does that mean? And what's the role for the various modes to most effectively provide capacity in a resilient, reliable, and environmentally benign form? The I've been reading a lot about it. We're certainly interested in it, and the knee-jerk reaction is, well, we need electric vehicles. But the problem with electric vehicles is you have to consider where the electricity comes from. If you're up in Washington and it's hydroelectric power from the Columbia River or nuclear power, the answer is different if you're getting it from coal. And
Hmm.
intermodal is conversion from truck to intermodal is a bigger improvement on sustainability than actually going from a diesel engine to an electric vehicle. But we haven't gotten that message across. We haven't delivered the product with all of the resilience and reliability we need to. But those are just two examples of issues
Hmm.
that industry and government are going to have to arm wrestle into a way that's accommodating. You can't have a situation where it's a boomerang every 2 or 4 years because you can't invest in that kind of time frame.
Yeah. Understood on that. I mean, that there's just so much. I mean, that's like you said, tease. I think that's the accurate description of what you just said. I mean, you can go in so many different directions with those categories there. Um, I am curious because the people that can affect change probably the most are probably some of the students that you mentioned that you're teaching. So what is the advice? I mean, let me ask it this way: what is your hope for this next generation of supply chain leaders who are coming out of university? What's your hope for them as they try to make impact in our industry?
Well, I would say the supply chain leaders, wherever they come, they may come out of universities, they may come up through the ranks. Um, I was very fortunate to, be well credentialed academically, but that doesn't necessarily make me any smarter than anyone else. But what I'm hoping for is that they can see the forest for the trees, that they can. I think the biggest issue with supply chain right now is people kind of forget if you don't have transportation, you'd better have one of those Star Trek teleporters. Everybody, there's the old joke about assuming the can opener. And I think people assume transportation capacity in all of this talk about, TMS and all this technology and all this fintech. Technology is important, but if you don't have capacity, you can't fake that. So you have to start with understanding how things move physically and then complement that with how things move, such as the money and the information. But transportation is the less glamorous part of the business, but it's still mission critical.
Amen to that, sir. So one last question, Ted, a little bit of a wild card. Now, you mentioned the Rolling Stones a little bit earlier. And so I'm curious, let's just say that somebody's making a video of the story of Ted Prince. What is the one song that's going to most accurately capture the life of Ted Prince by the Rolling
Johnny
Stones?
Casey got it at the Silver Kingpin. It's I can't get no satisfaction.
And that's where we'll leave it right there, sir. Hey, Ted,
So
thank you so much. Thank you so much for challenging the status quo, challenging us to be better in this industry, and for spending a little time with us here in the hot seat.
Okay.
That's going to do it for us today. We'll see you next time.